afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the session of the Professional and Academic Development Series. I thank you all for your attendance, and I especially thank our distinguished speakers today. Today, in our pads, we have a panel, and our subject is the definitions and theorizing about culture. Our speakers today are Carlos Rico, PhD. He is the Director of Academic Programs of Universidad Javeriana in Bogotá. He has written many articles and chapters about language methodology and evaluation, language materials, and intercultural competence. Isabel Tejada Sanchez, PhD, is an assistant professor at the School of Education at Universidad de los Andes in Bogotá. Her research interests include second language acquisition in instructional settings, interculturality, and growth mindset in education. Our third speaker is Dr. José Aldemar Álvarez Valencia. He's a professor at the School of Language Sciences at Universidad del Valle and the chair of the major of the emphasis in ELT education in their interinstitutional doctoral program at the same university. His current work focuses on interculturality and multimodal communication. We have scheduled 3 pads this semester. 2 of them will be dedicated to culture and interculturality. Today, our main focus will be culture. Our second pads, in a month, will concentrate on interculturality. So, briefly, I'm going to ask our panelists to start with a 5-minute statement about their own construction of the idea of culture. Later, I will ask some questions related to the topic at hand, and each will have a chance to answer them. Then we might have a discussion in which each panelist can complement or review their counterparts. And at the end, we can have an open forum with questions from the audience. You may write your questions in the chat or at the end. Please raise your hand to ask for the floor. So, uh, panelists, who would like to start with this 5-minute statement about your construction and your idea of culture?
Program you are working on. I know that those decolonial perspectives, the more I read about that, the more I understand culture from this point of view, where it has been used as a notion to also make distinctions amongst people. So that would be like my take on that. I can elaborate further, but I would like to also listen to Jose and Carlos about this and see how can I complement this. Thank you.
So, Carlos, um, your turn.
Okay, I'm so sorry. Well, I didn't open the microphone. So thank you very much for the invitations. I'm very, very happy to see you again. So for me, it's a pleasure to be part of this panel. So about this question, so I'm going to sound much more experiential rather than very academic or something like that. So the concept of culture also has to do much more in terms of, well, who I've been, yes, throughout these years. So what is the view of culture and what has inspired me having such a view? I think that my view about culture has evolved as my professional growth has taken place. I have to tell you, well, I started to study languages and then linguistics and then social sciences. And at the very beginning, I had a very restricted and limited view about culture. And that view was shaped by 2 specific disciplines, basically, language pedagogy and linguistics. In those days, well, I'm telling you about the beginnings of the 80s. Probably you were not born, yes, at that time. But we talk about the emergency of teaching culture because we believe that language was part of the culture, and it was necessary to know how a community or a particular group used that language. In the studies, we started to differentiate the group, the respective groups, yes, of language users and what they produce in terms of the cultural heritage. Well, I mean by this, what in Spanish we call patrimonios materiales like music, literature, food, and some other things. Me as a rural student, some of you, well, Jose, probably, well, do you know a little bit more about my life? Me as a rural student, I started to create my own social representation of such a group by means of accessing such literature. Can you imagine the sort of images I constructed at that time about culture? I was fascinated by the American culture, the British culture. And I wanted to be honest, yes, in those days, part of that dream. Yes, you are right, yes, that my concept about culture was linked at that moment to a nation. It was that idea that language was related to culture and culture related to nation or to a country. As years passed, I was inclined to study linguistics, specifically theoretical linguistics, or well, much more descriptive linguistics. And my view about culture was influenced by that specific discipline. And I started to talk about communities of speech and the importance of them within the culture. And I have to confess that I was very happy because I broadened that concept of culture, but at the end, it was the same thing. Yes, the concept was restricted to a discipline. And culture, well, it's much more than how people speak. But nowadays, as I am much more concerned of the importance of the social sciences in the ELT, and I have seen that my view about culture was absolutely limited in every sense. The concept of culture has fortunately been expanded due to the contributions of these other disciplines. But I wonder why we have constructed such wrong ideas about culture. And the answer, well, basically it's very easy, and it has to do with the way we approach the world. In other words, it has to do with the school of thoughts that we have lived with. I'm going to talk about more specifically in terms of modernism and postmodernism. Basically, this is a very important, yes, way of understanding, yes, culture. And also, I've been influenced by this, well, school of thought because of basically the way how I learned, yes, languages. Predominantly, well, some teachers, some methodologies has inscribed, yes, in these methodologies. But culture, as well as some other social entities like language, has not escaped to those school of thoughts and perspectives. The very first point that we have to consider is that culture cannot be viewed as a monolithic entity. If you let me talk about how this school of thought has defined the concept of culture, you will see a little bit more, yes, my point, in terms of modernism and postmodernism. So we really know, well, what was going on, what was the main purpose of modernism was the basis was the rationale, the importance of science. So the Enlightenment project of modernity, based on positivist approach of knowledge, then initially culture was seen as a part of civilization from an ethnographic sense, which includes knowledge, beliefs, arts, morals, laws, customs, and some other capabilities acquired as part of a member of any society. So this point, it was very important, but it was only the conception of one specific discipline. So the only ones who were able to talk about culture were, ethnographers, for instance, or specific disciplines. And but the big conclusion from this modern perspective is that culture is not an isolated notion for which only one specific discipline is able to understand the concept. I'm referring to anthropologists. So culture is not an isolated notion for which only anthropologists have access to, but we all are immersed in it. On the contrary, the postmodernist theory, or well, the school of thought, has been strongly influenced by while prominent thinkers. We have to read a lot about Michel Foucault, for instance, Jean-François Lyotard, Derrida, Jacques Derrida, among others. But basically, the postmodern shift would be characterized for a profound revolution in the structure of feeling. If you compare, the most important in modernism was the science, was the truth, was a unique answer. But in postmodernism, the most important was the individual, and specifically the structure of feeling. The central part of modernism is, in that respect, plurality instead of unity. Postmodernism made a shift in distinguishing the set of assumptions, experiences, and propositions to promote sensibility, practices, and discourse formations. So the discussion turns around the perspectives on culture as in postmodernist view, culture as a product, culture as a discourse, as practice, as an ideology. As you can see, culture cannot be understood only from one specific discipline. Yeah, like well, we did in modernist period. That it was that definition given by anthropologists. So the big conclusion, and that's maybe to finish this part, the big conclusion for this school of thought, the postmodernism, is to see how the culture is combined, yes, of complex systems based on mental representations about language, but also what we have to see that culture is an intricate system constructed within and through discourse, and also culture is an evolving dynamic system of interactions, and that we can define, yes, into a multidisciplinary perspective. This is one of the invitations that I want to start with, that culture should not be defined only under one specific discipline. This is what happened to me, to be honest. When I started to study languages, it was only defined by language pedagogy and then by linguistics. But as long as I've been studying a little bit more in the field of social sciences, that conception of culture has been broadened, yes? And it is necessary to assume that a specific point of view. That's my process, yes, in terms of studying culture.
Thank you very much, Professor Rico. Jose, please.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so yeah, Carlos, it's very interesting the way you build your story, and it also makes me think of how I have come to think of culture the way I think of it, right? Because in my academic trajectory, I've moved through very linguistic views towards more discourse-oriented views, and then finding those views little limiting, I ended up landing in semiotics. And so, so the way I see my view of culture is mostly inspired in the area of communication and social semiotics, particularly the work of Kress, Robert Hodge, Van Leeuwen, Carrie Jewett, and people from anthropology like Gertz, who also thought of culture from a more semiotic perspective. And we know every time you talk about semiotics, people think that that's kind of like a very complicated thing. And I would like to start by saying that by defining semiotics, semiotics, is the general study of meaning, of semiosis. you know, the processes and effects of the production, reproduction, reception, and circulation of meanings, you know, that agents of communication carry out in daily interaction. So then what we do in social semiotics is to examine the social dimension of meaning and explaining, you know, the processes, the structures through which meaning is constituted. When you think of traditional definitions of culture, you know, like you think of people, some people say it is folklore, it is language, it is behaviors, it is social practices, it is discourse, and so on. And then at the end of the day, what I feel is that all of those things are meanings, right? What we do in all of those cases is vehicling meanings, mobilizing meanings. And so that's why I think semiosis helps us understand that. And like there's like different principles that are important in semiotics, and I'm just gonna mention a couple of them. First of all, that in multimodal or social semiotics, we consider issues of power and agency because as you guys were saying, power and ideology is crisscrossing everything we do, and obviously culture. So in social semiotics, we think of power and agency in many making processes and the impact they have in social actors, on social actors. We also think that's semiotic production. That means meaning, the production of meaning, the distribution, the interpretation of meaning happens in different modes of communication. That's why we think that meaning is multimodal. And very important also that meaning is meaning in terms of semiotic acts or semiotic products are constituted and shaped from and through historical, cultural, and social enactments, you know, ways those things are materialized. And so I think that the individual is at the center here, because we are the ones who choose, we assemble those meanings based on our particular histories, our motivations and interests and processes of socialization. And so meaning is basically cultural. And then I use the term cultural semiotic resources. And maybe I'll help you understand that by, I repeat the concept, cultural semiotic resources. And to help you understand that, I always think of, let's think of a newborn, you know, let's think of a baby. What happens when you're born? You know, when you're a baby, right, you are immediately engaged in a process of enculturation, right? And so that process of enculturation is what we call socialization. Socialization refers to the process of becoming part of a society and a cultural group. So the main role of socialization is to socialize you into the meanings of the immediate community. That includes the systems of meaning, such as language. Immediately, you are socializing to the language of the community. The views of the world of the community, for example, what does it mean to be a woman? What does it mean to be a man? What are the ways in which, for example, gender needs to be performed in that society? You are socializing to the ways of being costeño, Bogotano, paisa, right? And on a broader scale, you're socializing to the ways of being Colombian, right? So, and then what happens is that you are socialized into different social groups, and then you develop certain affiliations. And obviously, those affiliations are strengthened by your understanding and acquisition of those semiotic systems, or those meanings of that group. And that's what starts shaping your identity. So what I think is that all of those systems of meanings in which we are socialized and that we start adapting and adopting become for us resources, and I call them semiotic resources. You know, they become a repertoire of meanings that we start enacting, we start living with or by, on the basis of the systems of meanings we're socialized into. And now the thing with these resources is that they are material, but they are also non-material. Like they are material because some of those artifacts that characterize a social group implicate language, rituals, and other practices common to the group, objects. But they can also be immaterial, like in the case of ideas, beliefs, discourses, ideologies, spiritual beliefs, and so on, like religion and so on. So now those semiotic resources are cultural. And so you might be wondering, why cultural? Well, because all of those meanings in which we are socialized are anchored in the tradition of our immediate community. So this means that semiotic resources are historical. For me, semiotic resources are historical, just as culture. Meanings that you assign to artifacts or social events and practices, they have reached some regularity, and that regularity is an intra-group regularity, right? And they become ritualized, they become sedimented through time. And this is why people think of something as cultural, right? Because this regularity, conventionalization, that anchor semiotic resources to tradition, produce social coordination. In that social coordination is normally expressed through individuals' cohesion, this sense of cohesion of a group, and then a sense of shared behavioral orientations, values, and beliefs. And this is why whenever you ask, what makes you Colombian, then you start thinking, people start thinking of what are those values, beliefs, orientations that we feel we share, that sense of shared behavioral orientation, of cohesion. So regularization, ritualization, conventionalization, group cohesion, coordination, I think are qualities that make something cultural and that make semiotic resources, the meanings, cultural. This doesn't mean that cultural semiotic resources are static. No, I think it's in social interaction that cultural practices or the meanings that we have built are enacted, but they are also contested and they are also reshaped. That's why culture in this view is very dynamic. So I just to close, one last thing another idea that I have is that what we do is we start a process of socialization, but at the end of the day, what we do is that we appropriate some of those cultural meanings, some of those semiotic resources, and at some point we make decisions of what is it that we want to accept and what is it that we don't want to accept, and make part of ourselves, to embody and to enact them. And cultural semiotic resources are unique to each individual. Even though we tend to we have this illusion that because we belong to a supposed cultural group, we are all the same. And no, every person builds a repertoire of cultural semiotic resources that is unique to this person. And the idea of culture as something that makes you belong to something is a personal illusion. That I don't know if you've there's a nice book by Bayard, a French scholar, and he has a book called The Illusion of Cultural Identity. And he's a historian, and it's really interesting because what he does is that he starts tracking, like the behaviors that some people think makes them belong to a certain group. And then when he does that, he realizes like what you think is yours as a nation is not yours. That was initially, that appeared in this other group, and for some reason, because of mobility, you ended up adapting it and clinging to it as yours. And so if we're thinking that things, that patterns of behaviors or practices is what constitutes culture, maybe that's an illusion. But that's how complex the human being is. We are always looking for ways to belong into something.
Thank you very much for your answers. So, three different views with different sources of inspiration from social studies, school of thought such as modernism versus postmodernism, and social semiotics. Okay, now our next question, there's no time limit for your answer, but remember we do have to finish before 6. So there is usually a gap between theory and practice, right? So there has been a lot of theorizing about culture in ELT and of course in other fields on how to approach culture in the classroom. But what about practice? In your opinion, has these discussions about culture impacting actual classroom teaching? Or is there still a very large gap between theory and practice in ELT regarding the teaching of culture and cultural aspects? So we may keep the same order if you like.
Okay. I do believe this is relative to contexts. Like, it really depends on where this teaching is taking place. And I would say that language teaching in Colombia, foreign language teaching, second language teaching, is still very much tied to this, compartmental view of language plus culture or culture plus language. I do believe there are still, many cases representing this, notion, especially where I am most interested in is like in schools, like in public schools. I do believe this notion is still very much segmented and separate. And this gap between theory and practice is still very much there. And I don't think it's the teacher's fault. I don't think it's the universities or the licenciaturas programs fault. I think it's what has been, a traditional view so far. So I think this debate is very much, even though we know that, as in the paper that was calling for this event, you mentioned Claire Cramsh, and this Claire Cramsh has been like talking about this ever since the 80s, the late 80s or something. We know this debate has been very much on the side, and language acquisition has been approached in a very, structural way for some reason. And as a person who did language acquisition for a while, I do believe this is the case. So my take will be that, yes, it's still happening. And I think one of the ways that culture can be embraced spontaneously in the language classroom is that we stop looking at, as Aldemar was saying, at culture as folklore, for example, or as something that is stereotypical. So in my classes particularly, that's like one of the main approaches that I take, like start by analyzing how stereotypical we are and how, and this is a cognitive, mechanism. Like our brain needs to do this. Like our brain needs to put people into small boxes so that it can process, more easily. The problem is when our brain gets used to that, right? So when we do this, our mindset really becomes, when we realize that we can stop, stereotyping and be more conscious and more mindful about the stereotyping, that's one way to approach this. So it can be something as, something as common as stereotypes. And that's something that really, if you look at it, if you work on it in the language classroom or in any classroom, actually, I do make the case for intercultural approaches across the curriculum, not just like the language classroom. I don't teach actually languages at all. And I do teach about education and language education, but I do believe the intercultural approach is there. So just to sum up, I think being mindful about how we approach and conceptualize culture in the form of, for example, stereotypes and other ways, as Aldemar and Carlos were saying, is one way or one mechanism to, reduce this gap.
Well, it is supposed to be my turn.
Yes, Carlos, your
Okay.
turn.
Yeah, very good. So I coincide, with you, Marisabel, in the conception, yes, about the importance of practice when teaching culture. But first of all, I would like to ask, what is practice when we talk about culture? We cannot say that when we theorized about culture, we left behind practice. Precisely because of practice, we need to theorize about culture. From my perspective, this is the problem of modernism. We tend to package everything. We are looking for living things, people, and basically this is the huge debate about culture. Maybe if it can be taught as any other aspect of language, or whether culture is a way, from my perspective, culture as a way of being in the world. If we think about this last idea, then it emerges an issue related to ethics. Who is the one authorized to say what's the weight of being in the world, or who has the authority to select what is representative of a given culture? The outsider who observes and studies the culture, or the insider who lives and experiences all the situations? These are some of the ideas given, as you also mentioned, Marisabel, given by Crunch, yes? One of these beautiful books, yes, that she has written about culture and identity. So if we are much more inclined to the last conception, then from my perspective, culture that cannot be easily taught. I totally agree that the conception of culture and the role of culture has impacted our classroom teaching in the sense of being aware of what is culture, or what culture, as also you mentioned, embraces, like self-awareness, the ability to look at himself, herself as an outsider, the skills to be a cultural mediator, the talent is that in certain way we experience to evaluate different viewpoints, the aptitude is to read the different cultural contexts, and to avoid bias related to others' identities. And probably the gap will be on the idea of how to bring all these aspects to the language classroom. Let's start by seeing our language students as little ethnographers. This is another point is that I want to bring to the discussion. Yes, try to develop on our students in the English classroom. Yes, that abilities to get our students to be very good ethnographers. What it is clear is that the new tendency of language teaching is based, this is basically what Crunch declares, on the 4 teaching needs. That's what she mentions, teaching needs. The first one is the intercultural sphere need. By this, we mean that we are not alone in the world. We are surrounded, as also José Aldemar said, we are surrounded by cultures. The second teaching need, it's related to the need to approach culture as an intercultural process. That means that for understanding culture, we need to adopt an intercultural approach. So that's what we also need to bring to our classes. Yes, to what extent maybe we can change, yes, that approach that we are still working on, the communicative approach. So why don't we adopt, yes, a different one. So my invitation is like to explore, for instance, the intercultural approach. The third teaching needs, what it is proposed by Crunch, it is the culture as a differential process. It means that culture cannot be packed and homogenized in the same way. Yeah. And the last one, it has to do with the need of crossing the disciplinary boundaries, that its culture needs to be understood, as I said before, under different perspectives. Yeah, because of, well, we always define culture, yes, like this, well, Milton Bennett, that of, yes, with the big C and the small c, or sometimes, well, we refer to the embedded in pattern system. But, well, I agree with that idea, but those definitions are just, well, given only by one specific point of view, one specific discipline. I really like, yes, to listen to Jose Aldemar, yes, that he's just trying to see in another different discipline like semiotics, yeah, why not, yeah, to try to understand, yes, how these other ways of signify the world, yes, can be applied, and how those ways maybe represent a community. So it would be quite interesting maybe if we started to see that the concept of culture, yes, need to be, I insist on that, it need to be broadened, yeah, in every sense. And that's what we need to do in the classroom. Otherwise, then we are just perpetuating that culture is the content. Culture is something that can be taught, yes, as any other aspect of language, as if we were teaching, I don't know, grammar or, well, any other aspect. But not, it is, as I said at the beginning, for me, culture also has to do with a way of being in the world, with the, well, within the community. Well, this is something that, of course, well, needs much more development, yeah. And well, at the end, probably we can talk a little bit more about that.
Okay.
Go ahead, Jose.
Right. So how has culture or the role of culture impacted classroom teaching? How large the gap is between theory and practice? All right. I think I'd like to go back to what Isabel and Carlos have just said. You know, the problem here is a problem of conceptualization. It's so paradoxical that there are more than 500 definitions of culture, but that is not sufficient because it seems like we have taken the wrong definition and we have limited so much. And this, of course, has to do with what Carlos says, which is the ways of thinking or construction of knowledge in of modernity, which we have inherited. We haven't been able to go beyond the ways of thinking and seeing the epistemologies of the modern project. So my take is, okay, so first of all, I'll say we have a problem, and is the way it's being conceptualized, which is in a very reductive way. But I also think that in terms of how it has arrived at language classrooms is because every educational change takes different steps to complete. And it may take a long time, you know, it usually takes a long time for a educational change to take place. For example, I think that there is a first stage that I would say is called recognition. And I think, for example, of the communicative language teaching approach. You think it started back in the 70s, and yet today you will see some teachers still teaching either grammar translation method or audiolingual grammar-based language teaching. So, so it takes some time for an educational philosophy to insert in the common parlance, you know, of the teachers and people, and then little by little, people start exploring it. I would say that's kind of like the second step. People start exploring it until it is adapted. And I say adapted in some way, not adopted, because people, teachers have agency, you know, and teachers have their contexts, and they will have to make adaptations. So in the case of culture, what I see is that the process is underway. So most teachers are aware of the importance of culture in language learning. So they're recognizing that. And so at least for some, they know that's a thing, right? That's one stage. Yeah, they're recognizing it, right? So that's the first stage. The second stage is that some start trying to infuse that perspective in the language classroom. And some are doing it, and they're running, you know, when they do it, they run into all of the possible challenges that it implies. And some others are more comfortably doing it. And I would say some of them are doing it under what Lyrico and Durbin and many others call the culturalist approach, you know, teaching, you know, the typical 4F approach: folk, food, festivals, and dances, and you know, typical behaviors, patterns, and all of that, which is observable, right? And so that's even if they've done it, the problem is that because they were given, I would say, a limited definition of it, even if they reach the point of kind of like bridging the gap theory, the gap between theory and practice, maybe it's still lacking, right? Maybe that's still lacking. So, and I would say there are two things that impact this theory practice connection. One is fads, you know, one is educational novelties, you know, happen so fast. And this is something that I said in one of the papers that I wrote a couple of years ago, that while some teachers are trying to understand the culturalist perspective, you know, like they're thinking of, oh, you know, culture is important in the language classroom and I have to teach it. Immediately before they are able to digest that idea and to try to bring it in the classroom, then they get the intercultural approach. So they haven't finished processing and going through the stages of the first fad, of this first trend, and suddenly they have to jump into the wagon of the intercultural approach. And who knows what's next? So you see, and this has happened with all academic innovations in Colombia. You know, when they are trying to understand audiolingual method, immediately CLT arrives. When they're trying to get a hold of CLT, immediately, no, now it's task-based. And then when they're getting task-based, oh, now it's content-based. And then suddenly CLIL, and I don't know where this is going. And so, all right, I'm just gonna close it here. And yeah, I'm just gonna stop because I could say some other things about this, but yeah.
Thank you very much, Jose, Carlos, and Isabel. Well, another common concern of teachers is when you tell them that they should teach culture or integrate culture rather than teach it integrated. Well, they feel, okay, I'm a non-native speaker. I haven't had that experience or that contact with an actual English-speaking or French-speaking culture. So can I really teach that without having that experience? Do I really have the resources to teach it? So what if you heard that from a teacher, what would you respond? What would you tell them?
Should I go first again?
Well,
Okay.
we can change, yeah, not necessarily.
Yes, as you wish.
No, it's okay. Yeah, I think I do have a couple of comments about that. I have actually been close to that reality in my work with public school teachers, and I think it's something very much like it's a fact. It's a fact that people say this, and I think it's also related to how policy is being implemented, and I think that's a very important thing to consider. And what do I mean by that? If you take entities such as the British Council and the way they are promoting English language learning in public schools in Colombia, they do have programs where culture is taught by the native speaker. And the native speaker is someone they call this person the cultural agent or the cultural promoter or something like that. And this person is the one who is empowered to be the cultural referent, whatever that is, whatever the cultural reference is. And I think since that is the reality and that is the practice that we are currently, as of 2021, we're having, I'm not surprised that teachers are thinking this, and there are, of course, as Jose Aldemar said, he is very right in that, all teachers have agency, and they are very much empowered by themselves, and I do believe this, and they have all the mechanisms, and when you talk to them, this is just a way of keeping things the way they are, and just like, okay, this is the program and they are going to teach culture, so I'm just going to focus on this. Some of them do question this, some of them do want to, combine their program with whatever is being taught by the cultural agent. But it's a concern to me to realize how much and how reinforced this separate view of the cultural, reference as being the native speaker or the person who actually comes from the English-speaking country, if we just talk about this language, is the one who can talk about this. So, and I just wanted to point out that that's a reality. And also, of course, it's going to continue if the practices that, as we said earlier, if we keep on conceptualizing culture and as something that's very, it's like a subject matter, and I think culture has to be much more spontaneous in the language classroom and much more subscribed to whatever the teacher is feeling with the language he or she is teaching. And I think when I come back to my experiences learning French and at Univalle, I was not aware that I was being taught culture, and I really thank Maria Eugenia for this. My dear French teacher there, she was teaching us a lot of things that were pertaining to culture and cultural references of the French-speaking world, and the word culture was never mentioned and never outspoken and never something that became part of a debate. It was just being there, and as Jose was saying, it was a meaning making practice. It was there through all the cultural representations, call it films, books, whatever was there, news, and those were the sociocultural debates that we were having, but it was never something that was explicitly brought up. And then I do make the connection right now, and I think it was something much more, I would say, much more complex to teach. And if I just divide my curriculum and say, okay, I'm now going to teach you cultural aspects, that to me sounds really unnatural of what the human practice or social practice is about. So yes, that would be my comment.
Jose, would you like to go so we can change a little bit the order? Refresh a little bit. By the way, I just want to highlight that we have 59 participants. Thank you everyone for being here. Go ahead, Jose.
All right, so yeah, first of all, this goes back to the problem we've already mentioned. This is because the definition of culture is limited definition. Is what I say is a transnational definition. And the transnational definition that people have of culture and intercultural communication is that when you teach culture, when you teach a language, that interaction with culture, or that intercultural communication only takes place when you talk with a person of another country, and of course that speaks another language. That is an idea that I don't know why is widely distributed in the field of English language teaching. You know, they only think that when you teach culture, it has to be the culture of the other country, and so like taking for granted that what we do is also important, and that the the meanings of semiotic, cultural semiotic resources of the student is not valid in the classroom. And so that's why that teachers think that they cannot teach it, you know, because they said if culture is, you know, what the other group, the other community who speaks the other language, and I haven't traveled, so I don't have any ways for me to teach that. I don't have the experience. And then I say, well, maybe the situation is that you're limiting yourself to thinking that you need. Okay, no. First of all, is the understanding that even if, or the example that I would give is this one. A paisa cannot speak for all Colombians, right? A costeño cannot speak for all Colombians. A paisa is not a representative of Colombia, just as a costeño, or even, or for example, un chocuano, right? Nobody can say it's representative of any cultural group, because that's just generalizing, right? Is this, as Isabel was saying, you know, like the native speaker who is in the school is taken as the cultural agent. That person is representing himself, right? And the cultural meanings in which this person was socialized into, but not necessarily representing the whole group. So one way to help teachers understand that they don't have to have trouble is what Carlos was saying before. We need to, first of all, having trouble or not is not the issue. You have, the attitude should be of an ethnographer. If you having trouble, you say, okay, guys, we're going to find out, you know, if we're talking about, example, typical topic, daily routines, right? Also, okay, you know, we've all grown depending on a lot of, this is where culture gets interesting, because if you talk about, so we've all grown up doing different routines, and is marked by race, is marked by gender, and is marked by regional provenance, right? It's not exactly the same routine for everyone. So if you have students start reflecting about those, their own context, you say, okay, now let's think of the other cultural group. What are some of the things they normally do, some of them? And let's study particular cases. And I think it's always thinking about, like, what you're seeing here is not like all North Americans do, or all British do. You know, it's just one example of what's happening. You cannot take it as the generalization for all the community. So so I think we have to decenter that idea that someone is representative of an entire group. Think of students and the teacher himself as an explorer. You say, look, if you haven't traveled, you do what you will ask your students to be an explorer. Do ethnography. Have them watch a movie. Have them watch one of these, you know, typical soap operas, and try to see what happens in there and how it could be informative of what the other community does, or representatives of those communities do. Yeah, that's and the other thing is, I mean, the way to debunk this is with asking the teacher to reflect on some things, you know. with the idea of I having trouble. You know, I was thinking of it's like spending the summer in Medellin doesn't make a foreigner an expert in Antioqueñidad. You ask the same a person, you know, spending 3 or even 2 or 3 years. I lived in the US for almost 5 years, and I lived in one particular city, and it's Tucson, Arizona. And I just say, I more or less know some of the things that happen in there, but I cannot generalize that to the whole of the United States, because it's just like in Colombia, many regions, you know, many people, different categories and different variables that impact your understanding of what people do and the meanings they assign to that. I don't know if this makes any sense, Carlos.
Jose, but after being 1 week in Medellin, well, you changed the way how you speak. So you started to use
Get
that
the accent.
Paisa accent. Yes, it's amazing to see that. This is the power of interactions. This is the power of being exposed to. Yeah. So why not? So probably, well, I'm going to change now and start to pronounce yes like Paisas. So well, this is what happens. This is the marvels yes of language and culture. So Carlos, the question is that you now ask, it's absolutely important. I think this is very relevant nowadays because of with this question. So we demystified what culture is and how culture should be presented in the language classroom. But first, please do not continue to talk about the distinctions between native and non-native speakers. This concept of modernism, it's used to discriminate groups and to reinforce the supremacy of other cultures. Yeah. So I don't know if conscious or unconsciously, well, we always insist that, using those terms. On the contrary, from the postmodern, I'm sorry to insist a lot because of yes, this school of thoughts. Yeah, but basically this is the justification why we have approached yes everything under specific ways. So from the postmodern perspective, we avoid this colonialized discourse of knowing and being. So why don't we say that we are language users? That's it. It's better rather than saying yes that you are the native or not native speaker of that language. No, I'm a language user. Again, regarding your question about cultures, yes, in plural, should not be related to any language or any nation. As I said before, we don't need to be native or non-native to understand and approach the culture. Culture is not a content that you can teach or something that you can learn. Culture is there with us. We need to comprehend it and interact within it. Yes, that's why in ELT, we need to be not culture consumers, but culture mediators. Definitely, I'm very convinced that we need to prepare our students to be very good ethnographers and culture mediators. Pupils should take the role of comparative ethnographers to observe the world in critical ways, in critical manners, by creating their own hypotheses or sharing yes, their own experiences with others. So as listening to you, Jose, then nowadays, well, we have lots of resources in which, well, we can get the students to make very interesting, well, case studies or maybe very good research exercises. Well, for saying something, try to use some documentaries, some, well, series on Netflix or, well, whatever thing that you can get into using technology. Well, what I want to say is that culture is seen as a dynamic process of change, as a symbolic system. The interpretations of culture, of course, well, can be ambiguous and they can result in confusion and conflict when encountering representatives from different groups of cultures. For that reason, culture is identifiable complex of meanings, symbols, values, and norms that are shared consciously or unconsciously, yes, by a group of people. Then my personal invitation is to help our students to become valid culture mediators. But please do not take my positive definition of valid, yes, in that way. What I want to mean is they need to be aware of the role, yes, as culture mediators. So this is, believe me, an invitation, yeah, just to take up a different role, yeah, in our language classroom, yeah, to try to get students, maybe instead of learning a set of or a list of, well, even patterns or ways in which people do the things, but just maybe to develop some abilities to get students become much more aware on how to deal well with the difference, on how to interpret, yes, the different sort of meanings, how to approach, yes, the things in a different way. So basically, that's what I would like to propose, yeah, a different approach, yes, of teaching English or, well, any language, not to continue to work well with this communicative approach, yes, as we said before. From my point of view, I think that we are just fed up, well, with that idea of teaching functions and maybe how to become effective, yes, when communicating something. So I think it is necessary maybe to develop some other things in which students are required to be mediators. Yes, they have to be ambassadors, yes, even of their own culture. So, but sometimes they don't know how to do it. And then it is necessary to develop such as skills. And that's what I want to propose, new ways, yes, in the way of approaching culture when teaching, yes, languages, or, well, whatever the content is, yeah. So try to change, yes, that paradigm.
Carlos,
Yes.
I just wanted to jump into
Yes.
to ask, like some, because what you're saying about the students becoming mediators, you see, the problem right now is that students are not going to become mediators because the teacher does not want to adopt or assume that role, because the teacher, as Carlos is posing in his question, is that the teachers are afraid of doing it because they don't feel legitimate. They don't feel legitimate to legitimize to be saying anything about the other community. And so what I'm thinking is that we have what we need to
But why,
do.
Jose, they are not feeling legitimized, yes, in the classroom? So it's a certain of I don't know, frightened or
Yeah,
what
it's
is that?
because what Carlos was saying, like, because they haven't traveled, right? Because they haven't been and they don't know firsthand the other cultural group. And but what I'm saying is that then what we have to do is to de-essentialize, because they think, like, what if I am saying something wrong? And what I'm saying, if you adopt an ethnographic perspective in which you de-essentialize things, you say, look, this is what we can observe, this is what we see, the ways I think they make meanings, but it doesn't mean that is totally true for everyone. If they are scared of, like, oh, I don't wanna say something is false or is incorrect because I have in trouble. I say, well, just chill out. We cannot essentialize. We cannot say all Bayunos, all people from Caleños dance salsa, right? Because that's not true. So maybe we de-essentialize that there is certain true about certain group and another group, and we only focus on doing ethnographic work. You see what meanings they make,
But
you report, you analyze, and then you say this may not
it's
apply
because
to
of we need
everyone.
to reconceptualize, yes, that idea of culture. Because
Yeah.
what does it, that idea of culture is a content. So that's what you are scared because of, probably you do not possess all the enough knowledge, yes, about that. So definitely, even in our own culture, even in our own language, so we do not possess all that knowledge. So that's not going to be the point. So we need to start to change, yes, that perspective, yes, of thinking that culture, it has to do well with a nation, with something apart, yes, from something that is there, yes. So, and then if you don't know that, so probably you are not going to be able to, yes, to refer to the way in which probably, well, you can say, this is how we can interact, this is the way of doing the things, this is, yes. So we need definitely to conceptualize, yes, that idea of culture in teaching languages, because probably, well, that's evident, yes, the sort of feelings, yeah, that well, we can see on teachers, yes, that they represent culture because of, yes, the external things, yes, an amount of knowledge, yes, that represents a weight of in which a community is. Well, that's not culture. So, well, we need to expand that idea of culture, definitely. I'm sorry.
No, 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 please, we have to apologize. That's the idea.
Because of time, so.
Oh, don't worry. Great. Well, but so you've been mentioning new conceptualizations, new concepts. For example, Jose talks about meaning making, semiotic resources. Um, Carlos talks about ethnography, mediation. So you're proposing a very different view from what most teachers are familiar with. But what about, the traditional tools of the trade? What about grammar, vocabulary, pronunciation? Do we still teach them, or this cultural perspective implies abandoning those traditional tools? What do you think? Would you like to start, Carlos?
Yes, it is. Well, very good. So I think that grammar, vocabulary, and pronunciation, well, definitely they are very, very important and very relevant. They are part of the language, and they need to receive all our attention. But from my perspective, the issue is that language teaching should not be devoted totally to the teaching of these aspects. Language as culture are very complex processes that are related to other aspects like the individual, the society, the politics, the ideology, well, and many others. Perhaps the question, sorry if I am wrong, is on how we should teach those aspects of language. If you let me, I can suggest the, sorry to insist a lot on that, but the intercultural approach, yes, as an alternative. In this regard, more than teaching, for instance, the RP British English. You know what is the RP? Yes, the RP is the
Received
received pronunciation, yes, typically, well, characterized by the way
the
of
Queen's
how the
pronunciation.
queens and the kings, yes, way of speaking. So more than teaching this RP, British, or well, whatever the variety is, as an example, we should teach the importance of language varieties in this, specifically in this globalized world, and how important is to develop, for instance, listening skills. We need to be able to acoustically understand different sort of accents and ways of speaking. If we do so, maybe our students will be grateful. Please, no more of the communicative approach. We need to change, yes, that page. I want to invite to experience the intercultural approach, yes, to teaching languages. I think pronunciation is very important. But when teaching that, so what it's going to be much more important. So it's going to be understanding, comprehension, yes, because of in this world where everyone speaks differently, different accents, and the point is, are you able? Sorry to say that acoustically, are you able to, yes, to understand. But you are not going to ask to somebody, could you please speak properly? Could you please speak, yes, in this way, because of you have to use the standard way of, or maybe to use the pattern. No, well, I think that we need to develop some other skills, yes, to be able to understand, yes, what the others are trying to say to you. So that's going to be the invitation. So I agree with that question, Carlos, that I think, yes, grammar, pronunciation, yeah, they are very important, definitely, yes. So now, because of the new trend is maybe to privilege, yes, culture, and then now we are interested in teaching, yes, and maybe discussing about culture, then we are going to forget, yes, the essentials, the fundamentals. No, well, we have to continue to, yes, to teach that. But what I invite is, well, to teachers is maybe to do it in a different way, yeah? How is important, yeah, for instance, nowadays pronunciation in this world, yes, that, well, we cannot experience borders, yes, that you can get access to somebody, even you don't need to be in the country where that language is spoken, then, but you can have access. But you can get in touch well with somebody from a different culture, a different language, yeah? Well, the question is, what are gonna be those skills, what you need to develop, yes, to make such interactions possible? So that's going to be, well, the biggest question, yes, that we would have to state nowadays, yes, to teachers. But definitely we don't have to abandon, yes, the idea to say that, no, well, because of now it's very, very important to talk about culture, then try to change, yes, these other aspects, which we know they are very, very important, yes, in language teaching. That's well my point of view.
Thank you, Carlos. Would you continue, Isabel, please?
Thank you. It's been very interesting to listen to you, Carlos and Jose. I agree with some of the things that have been said. I think there needs to be a different approach. I'm still debating whether we can, teach language otherwise. I do believe it's possible. I do believe we don't need to emphasize on this, separation, as I was mentioning before, which is to me a structuralist point of view. But I do understand the need for that structure, and I do see your point, Carlos, there. And I was thinking this as a teacher and also as a language learner myself. I love to learn languages, and I try to learn a new language every year. And I have been thinking about this, like from a meta-linguistic point of view. How do I work this out in my mind? And I think pronunciation has definitely been important for intelligibility, of course, as you were saying. Like, you need to get your message across, and then accent becomes something. The more you understand that accent, is associated with something that it's either a power structure or a hierarchy. The more you privilege more intelligibility over accent, and then and you understand also that the prosodics of language are important, but not for affiliating yourself with certain accent or certain nation representation. And I think the way we learned our English and our French, I think, was pretty much like associated with that before. Now I think it's much more liberating, and I don't feel bad if I have an accent, whereas I used to, feel that pressure over me. But yeah, that's one thing. So I think we do need to deconstruct our approach to language and make it like more liberating. And by that liberation, I would, suggest that I think it really comes down to what resources we have right now. And, Jose has, emphasized on this a lot today. And I do feel that, learners right now are privileged in that sense as well. Like the access to these many resources that you can get is something amazing. Like I cannot think of a better time to learn languages than today. And at the same time is a very conflicting time because you have very good tools to translate and make it, effortless as well. So this is something that as teachers we also have to struggle with, right? Like the need for the translator to make things, less complicated. So that would be one thing. And regarding the other aspects, such as grammar, such as the varieties, I do, I really support this approach. I think what Adriana Gonzalez is doing at Universidad de Antioquia is great with the, English as a lingua franca reflection. I think this awareness for the language learners that, learning English is just like at a different level today, like to be part of a global conversation. It's something that we should also, emphasize, and not just because I want to, as Albert Memmi would say, I don't want to be the colonized who wants to be like the colonizer, like that's how we learned English. We wanted to be like the, as Carlos, the forbidden word. We wanted to be the native speaker, like we wanted to resemble the native speaker. Now it's not the case. Now we embrace more this idea of, you may call it English as a lingua franca. There is a debate of English as an international language. I think these are both valid if we think of them as constructs that help us, engage in a conversation that should be, you know, for all of us. And that's what really saddens me about this kind of like panels and situations and circumstances, is that we are leaving out still many people who, didn't have the privilege to learn English as we did and to use English as we do right now. And those people are the people I'm concerned about. And not because they don't learn, not because they didn't learn English, because they do not see the point of learning English, because it's not there yet. And I don't want to be misinterpreted as, speaking English equals, better economics and opportunities, etc. But I do feel that the more we emphasize on this necessity of learning this language, the more we belong to a global conversation, and the more some people are left out. So that's like one reflection I wanted to also leave to the floor, to the audience today. Thank you.
Go ahead, Jose, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to, make a comment about, because Carlos has been talking about interculturality and intercultural communication. And I think we've been biting our tongues here, because the colloquium today was about culture, right? And we are all working on intercultural communication, but we want to keep it because we have a second path in a month on interculturality, and we will have other guests. So we don't want to use up the topic, and then next time people are like, we you guys said that last time. So that's why we're kind of like keeping it down to the cultural discussion. So about this question, I'm not really settled on an answer here, because, well, when you think of SLA, and that's, I've been haven't done a lot of work, but that's what my PhD was on, SLA. And SLA research reports that because people, especially young adults and adults after the critical period, well, you have a different cognitive, a stage of cognitive development, which is not that of a kid, right? And that cognitive development, it has its advantages, and one of the advantage is that you can use more all of your mental processes to process language faster. And when it's given more directly, it's easier for the brain to process. Remember, processing in the brain doesn't mean you being able to enact it. You know, that's the difference between performance and competence and performance. You know, if you have it in your mind, you know it, you understand it, but then you can't perform it because it has to do with social interaction and real context, right? So, so the paradox is this one. You know, our young adults and adults, they want to know the grammar because the state of their mind is like, I want to know the logics of stuff. Kids don't do that. Kids just learn whatever you give them. They're not over processing stuff. You know, they don't do that. Adults, we do that. We want to know why do I put do and that's here, and what, you know, like, and an adult needs that. And what I'm saying is, if he or she needs it for its, because he needs to feel at ease with the idea that he logically understands that, you can do it, but don't spend 40 minutes explaining that. You know, that can be done quickly, and then you go on to the practice and to make it more natural, more in a context, and to make it a need. When you make things communicative need, it just flows easily into people, right? So that's one of the things. And what Isabel was saying is great, because we're not learning languages today as people learned languages 20 or 30 years ago. And this has to do with, you know, in SLA, they, of course, because of the research and all of that, they developed during those early stages of SLA, they created like a learning trajectory for everyone. You know, and that learning trajectory says like you give the grammar and people learn it this way. That's how they created the syllabus and the textbooks. They are thinking in one learning trajectory. Well, it so happens that because of the explosion of mobility, globalization, and all of these things, people are having different learning trajectories that were not anticipated by SLA. Right? So it seems like SLA is still stuck in that very learning trajectory that research gave them, but nowadays the learning trajectories have exploded, you know, and then you may need, some people learn languages on websites, interacting with other people without even caring about grammar, right? Or they have communicate through basic knowledge they have, and then translators, images, videos, and so on. That's why multimodal communication nowadays is so important. So do we need to teach grammar? I say yes. And also because grammar is culture. You know, language is culture. When you say hello versus hi, you are indexing something that is cultural, and that cultural is formality versus informality when you talk to people. That's cultural. So grammar, language, words, all index culture, and maybe teachers lose that connection, and that's why it seems like the teaching is plain, and maybe making those connections will make language more meaningful to students. That's it.
Well, thank you,
All right, thank you.
and have a great
Thank you very much.
afternoon.
No, thanks. Thanks.
Thank you very much, guys.
Thank you, Carlos.
It was
Thank you, Isabel.
really nice to see you all. Thank you.
Bye-bye. See you.
Bye-bye.
Have a good one. Bye.